Hello friends, for today's video we're going to be going through some books I've picked up this year that haven't really worked for me. And the goal with this is not to just simply hate on these books, but rather it's sort of the opposite. I don't have any issues recommending books regardless of whether they worked for me or not. It's just that when I really love something, because I love it, it tends to be more at the forefront of my mind. And then when I am making lists of certain works, like adult fantasy recommendations that fill in the blank, that you can read in a day was one I did recently, or that have actual adult main characters, those sorts of things. The books that I really enjoy are the ones that tend to come to me first. And I do find that the ones I don't like as much can kind of fall through the cracks, even though I'm fully aware that a lot of you might really enjoy them, you might resonate with them, and I feel it's almost unfair that because I didn't like them very much, they don't get as much attention. So as a result of that, I am going to be mentioning some books that didn't work for me. I am going to let you know a little bit about them. I am not necessarily going to filter the reasons why they didn't work for me. I'll be open about that. But I do absolutely think that many of you are able to discern whether or not the things that didn't work for me are going to be cons for you or not. And you can decide for yourselves if it sounds like something you might want to pick up. So with that said, I'm actually going to start with two that I'm going to categorize as honorable mentions, because I wanted this to just be a list of the 5 books that I have liked basically the least this year, but there were 4 that really stood out, and then these first 2 I'm going to mention kind of tie for 5th / I almost don't know that I entirely disliked them, but I didn't love them either. So the first one on this list is going to be How to Sell a Haunted House. I did a very long, in-depth review. This is actually a little outside of my norm. It is more so thriller horror, and as many of you know, or if you're new, can guess by looking at my shelves, I primarily read fantasy. I was excited to pick this one up because it seemed like, okay, I'm going to be very upfront. I picked this up because I heard that there were puppets in this, and I had recently been playing the game Lies of P, which is phenomenal, by the way. And that game, it's basically robots, but they refer to them as puppets. And I was like, oh, this feels like perfect timing. I jump into it. It's by an author whose works I have wanted to read for a long time, and I've heard that they're very funny. I am kind of very pathetic when it comes to scary things, so I was like, oh, okay, this will be a good one to take that step into some horror. The setup is that you follow this young woman who her family, she has a brother and her parents recently have passed away, so she flies back home to help her brother with all the arrangements that come when somebody in your life passes away. And a lot of this involves what they're going to do with their parents' house. Her and her brother are definitely butting heads. They can't decide, do they want to sell the house? And how long do they wait until they sell the house? They argue about every little thing, and anytime something comes up, it's clear that they're not only avoiding their grief, but they also maybe have a lot of unresolved tension from events from their childhood. So I was really enjoying the dynamic between these two. I feel like the author absolutely captured all of what family drama can entail. But the book takes a very hard right turn about halfway through, where in the beginning, you're getting a lot of this familial drama, and within that, you're getting little creepy things that are happening. You do discover that the mom had this sort of obsession with these puppets, and she would refer to them in a way that was very much like she had this connection and fondness of them. They're like, oh yeah, the puppets, those were so weird, right? It's clear to you, the reader, like something's up with those puppets. And the further you get, the more it's clear, like, yes, indeed, something's up with those puppets. I do think that the synopsis and the title kind of give the wrong impression, because the title of How to Sell a Haunted House makes it seem a lot more like it's a haunted house story when really it's a weird puppet story. The weird hard right turn that I was getting at is it gets to be, in my opinion, rather satirical. The characters behave in the most unreasonable ways. I found the dialogue to be exceptionally cringy, and it was actually super funny because it was so over the top. And this is why it's an honorable mention, because on one hand, I'm like, it was kind of hilarious. But on the other hand, I'm like, it was also really ridiculous, which is not necessarily a recipe that always doesn't work for me. Oftentimes ridiculous and hilarious go together really well. And I like when you have poignant commentary within that too, which I feel like it sort of does on the topics of grief and familial relationships. So I'm very mixed on this. There is a party that almost would want to reread it just simply because at the end of the day, it was extremely entertaining. And I feel that there were some things in there that I enjoyed. I think I just would have preferred if the blend had been more throughout the entirety of the book rather than starting relatively normal and then about halfway through getting really bizarre. But if you are interested in hearing more thoughts, as I said, I did do a very long, in-depth, I was about to say tutorial. That's not what it was. It was a review. I did a long, in-depth spoiler review, and I think I talked non-spoiler at the beginning, so if you do end up watching that, you can probably just skip ahead because I just told you kind of the general synopsis. Anyway, yeah, I just have such mixed feelings on that one. Anyway, moving on. Next up we have, very, very different from that, The Warm Hands of Ghosts. This is by the same author as the Winternight trilogy. This is an author that tends to, it would seem, fit very comfortably within writing historical fantasy, although the Winternight trilogy is a lot more of a blend of historical fantasy, whereas The Warm Hands of Ghosts is basically speculative, where it's historical fiction with a little bit of a mix where you have some things in it that you're like, is this real? The idea of it I felt was incredibly moving, and there were certain themes that I really, really felt could have been something I absolutely loved, but the execution of the story and some of the execution of the relationships between characters, I just felt like didn't quite play out in a way that I ultimately found satisfying. So the idea is that the Great War is occurring, and our main character, her name is Laura, I believe, she was a combat nurse, and then she was injured, so now she's been released. She went back home. Her brother, however, is still a soldier, and she gets news that he has died, but there's some things about his death that just don't seem to be adding up, so she decides to go back to Europe, excuse me, I said that really weird. She decides to go back to Europe to investigate for herself what might have happened with her brother. And I think part of what I mean by the way in which the story played out didn't quite work is that I think that by maintaining a level of mystery, if you're just following Laura, then that builds suspense and you're constantly wondering, like, did her brother die? Is he still alive? And that isn't really the story because you do get her brother's perspective. And there is maybe a hint of, because it gets into territory where you're wondering, is this even happening? You could question oftentimes within his perspective, like, wait a second, is he alive? Did he die? And now we're just kind of looking at where his mind has gone. You know, there are certainly ways that the story still has a sense of mystery within it. It's just not the sense of mystery that maybe the initial beginning of the story would lead you to believe. I actually found, I think, interestingly, that the story would have been much stronger had we just focused primarily on Freddie, the brother, because his plot line was the one that I actually feel like leaned into horror territory, and I can't really say why because it's a little bit of a spoiler, but the sister's perspective grew to be a little dull, just a little bland, and I do feel it was intentional because she has experienced a tremendous amount of trauma, so I almost feel like the narrative is matching the way that maybe the character is trying to shut herself off so that she doesn't have to process all of the pain. But it did kind of result in, I just feel like we could have incorporated that concept in a way where it didn't make her perspective so lacking in being engaging, but other people are going to feel completely different. There are certain details involving the brother's perspective that it kind of felt like some of the relationships were rooted in bonding via trauma. And I understand that's a very real thing that happens. I also just found that it meant that the bonds that do form, it felt like we were meant to buy into it simply because that trauma had been experienced by Freddie and another character, but you hardly ever actually see them like speak to each other, and you don't really see there being like relationship building. It's kind of just, oh yeah, so they've bonded. And I understand, once again, I really want to emphasize, I understand that is actually relatively realistic, but it means that I think the reader has to do a lot of the sort of emotional work on behalf of the characters. They kind of have to fill in the gaps, which is not something I'm always opposed to because I don't like this phrase, but I know a lot of you know what I mean, so I'm going to use it. Sometimes it can feel like authors really hold your hand and walk you to a conclusion, and other times authors sort of back off and they allow you to recognize human behavior for what it is, or they allow for the room of interpretation, as a lot of times we don't actually know what's going on in a person's head, but we can speculate, and that mirrors what real human interactions are like. And I think that there's a balance, and for me, I felt like this book, it sort of relied on us doing that so much. So at the end of the day, it just didn't ultimately work. But again, this one and How to Sell a Haunted House, maybe you can tell by how I'm describing these that I ultimately didn't really hate these or anything like that. I just think they didn't quite end up clicking, but I definitely think they're going to work for so many other people. So if either of these sound good, definitely check them out. And I'll have everything I talk about today in the description bar down below if I forgot to mention that at the beginning. But anyway, now jumping into the ones that I'm like, I mean, no, but, you know, other people, sure. Start with the one that I'm like, I mean, it was kind of funny. It just wasn't for me. And it's very easy to get through. And that would be That Time I Got Drunk and Saved a Demon. That is basically the synopsis. The title of the book is the synopsis. A young woman whose family, they're spice merchants, and her name is Cinnamon. And she finds a demon man who, of course, is super hot. And she realizes, like, oh my gosh, you're a demon man. And then it turns out that the way that people have been told to view demons is not actually accurate. So her whole world gets flipped upside down when she discovers this. And then she very quickly is like, well, I guess she doesn't necessarily decide for herself that she's going to accompany the demon man to rescue his people. It's more of like she's kind of almost forced to, but anyway, she does go alongside him on this quest. And it was very kind of campy and quite over the top. I do appreciate how self-aware this book is, as it both utilizes and kind of pokes fun at a lot of the tropes that you see within fantasy romance and romance books. I do enjoy that quite a bit. However, at the end of the day, this story from a fantasy level just didn't quite work for me, but it was pretty funny. Let's talk about When the Moon Hatched. It was really long, and I am not opposed to really long books, especially if I'm loving it, then I'm like, yes, give me more. But this one, it just kind of kept sort of spiraling into something that I was enjoying less and less the more I read. I did a video where I sort of compiled a list of various different traits within a lot of popular books, especially popular fantasy romance books, and talked about how I don't think there's anything wrong with any of those tropes being within books, and I think a lot of them can be really, really fun. I'm finding that within a lot of the popular works, however, it's not just that there's maybe one or two or three of those tropes, but it can feel like it's almost the entirety of this list, which I think I had at least 10 things within this list, and this book met almost every single one of them. So even though there are some interesting world-building details about this one, at the end of the day, it just felt like I was reading a mashup of so many other things that I've picked up before. It especially felt like it was quite inspired by Sarah J. Maas's works. I found the further we got, the more it felt kind of like the Night Court and being revealed to those characters within a court of Mist and Fury, I think specifically. So it kind of felt like there was even the character kind of having this cabin that the two main characters end up in at some point, and they like bond within, which again, not that that in isolation is a bad thing, but it just felt like the way that you sort of have this inner circle and you have this sense of found family with this inner circle, and there's this character who you believe to be antagonistic, and then it turns out they just allow that to be their reputation so they can better protect their people, and it's kind of this hidden, almost hideaway of a city that's actually thriving, and this person really cares about their people. It's pretty much that in both ACOTAR and in that series and within When the Moon Hatched, except for, even though I'm not a huge ACOTAR person, I just know a lot of people are familiar with it, or maybe you are a fan of it. I do feel like ACOTAR, it sort of takes its time as it gets through the story and these things are introduced to you, whereas this one, it was like really combining a lot within one book. And I think that I liked a lot of the concepts that were there, even though some of them were so similar to things I've seen. I just wish that we had taken the time to sort of press pause and flesh out a lot more of it. So as an example, within the beginning of the story, there is sort of this inciting incident with our main character and somebody she cares about, and that leads her down a path of revenge. And this path of revenge eventually means that her life crosses paths with the other character that I was talking about. I felt like everything within that beginning, I would have preferred if we had spent so much time with that, so that I cared a lot more about her revenge quest, so that I cared a lot more about the inciting incident itself. I really thought that the world seemed interesting, but it did feel like I was given everything I needed to know right in the moment where it was relevant, instead of getting foreshadowing to things or subtle ways that the world is being built for you in ways that you almost don't even notice. I did a whole video kind of dedicated to settings and the building of settings that I feel like this book didn't do it in the way that I prefer, but a lot of people love the world building in this. A lot of people love the relationship between the characters. A lot of people love the tropes that are within this. So even though it was a miss for me, if you are an individual who, if you liked all the parallels that I was talking about with it and ACOTAR, then there's a good chance that it will work for you. If you like the idea of fantasy romance with a cool world, but you don't necessarily need to feel like it's so fantasy heavy, you just kind of want the world to feel a lot cooler than maybe something like That Time I Got Drunk and Saved a Demon, then there is a good chance that this one might work for you. It just was ultimately a miss for me. After that, we have Guns of the Dawn. I feel like this is the getting into the territory where it's probably the most unpopular within kind of my circle of the books that I like to read. I felt that the themes in this were really important. A lot of it has to do with propaganda, how we deconstruct what we've been told, and the horrors of war and the way that trauma affects us. The setup is that you're looking at this sort of Pride and Prejudice style of story, except for there is a war going on that the majority of the population that our main character, Emily, lives within, they believe that this war is not only just, but that they are winning because, of course, they are, because they're exceptional. And Emily buys into this. You as the reader are like, this is so obviously propaganda, which I'll get into why that slightly irked me. But Emily is a character who she ends up, because there's a draft at some point for women, she ends up going to war. And then from there, you're seeing the horrors of war and Emily kind of trying to just get by. And again, all the themes I was talking about, I really appreciate all of those themes. I did find that some of the execution of certain things was a little cartoon villain-ish, and certain scenes just felt like they existed so that we could show Emily is a awesome female protagonist. But I don't know, I kind of am tired of the character being assaulted to prove that she's awesome, which happens multiple times in this story. I'm just kind of like, women can be awesome just in general, right? But also, sorry, that was especially vibey. I just didn't love that particular element of the story, and I do feel like with how much it felt that the author was trying to really, really emphasize the themes of propaganda and deconstruction and things like that, I wish that for the times that we had assault in the story, I wish that maybe there had been a little bit more reflection in general, but there really wasn't, so that was disappointing. That wasn't necessarily, though, the reason that I didn't love this work. I also felt like, getting back to the propaganda elements, for a story to, I think, showcase propaganda in a way that is satisfying for me as a reader is a couple of different options. One is that, yes, you, the reader, are aware of it, but to some degree so is the character, but they also don't know what the real truth is, and they don't know how to escape it. And I feel like a great example of this is Sword of Kaigen, and you have to really establish the stakes of if you do start to deconstruct and you do realize, oh, never mind, everything I've been told is a lie, I want to then see the characters grapple with, okay, well, now that I know this, what am I going to do about it? And if they do try to do something about it, how much danger are they in? How much danger is their family in? What can happen if you do try to push back or if you try to inform other people? I feel like when it starts to feel very insidious and you don't know who you can trust, that's when I feel like those kinds of stories can be really impactful. But instead, it was, in this particular instance, it's just like, I just watched everybody believe it for so long, even though the evidence was there over and over and over again, and I recognize that the point is, like, okay, this character has been told something for so long that they, of course, it's worked into their brain, and you as the reader can see it because you're an objective third party. But it's going to take a while. But some of it, I'm just like, oh my gosh, can you question a little bit? And even when they would start to question certain things, they would then turn around and be like, no way, about something else. And I'm like, okay, once that ball gets rolling and your mind is starting to open up a little bit, or the character's mind is starting to open up a little bit, I want them to start to approach things with a little bit more skepticism. It doesn't mean that they have to completely question everything. And again, it is realistic for people to deconstruct one thing and then completely be oblivious about how much they're, I'm going to use the word brainwashed, even though it's probably not the best word, but how much they're essentially brainwashed in this other area. I recognize that that can happen, but at some point she just kind of seemed stupid. I mean, some of it was just like so blatant, and I'm like, how are we still, how are we, like, I just needed her. And that's the other way that it can frustrate me, is like the option where it can work, the second option, because I laid out the other option of when it can work is when, sure, the character is completely in the dark, but you as the reader are in the dark too. I think that can be very powerful, because when the revelations start to happen, you're like, wait a second, because that to me is actually compelling and it's convincing. I don't like watching characters, oh my god, I mean, I'm like, dude, what does it take for you to stop being like so oblivious for so long? And I think there's so many other things, like the romance in this, I'm sorry, I think it's atrocious. I think the romance in this is terrible. I feel like I understand that, like, the toxic love interest, for some people, for some readers, I'm not trying to shame anybody who feels this way, but it can be entertaining, or maybe that's what they're looking for. Like, they don't want the sunshine golden retriever love interest. They, like, want that character that's maybe not the best, whatever the case may be. But this character, I actually did a whole spoiler video about this also, like how to sell a haunted house, excuse me. But I get in detail. I can't really talk about it here because it would spoil some stuff. But the character is, like, really kind of, like, possessive, and I feel like even though their whole relationship is sort of built on, like, well, they never lie to me, I'm like, there was one instance where they kind of did, and it was kind of a big deal, and it was kind of about somebody else who went off to war who maybe didn't actually have to go off to war. I don't feel like they were totally transparent about that, and I guess we just forgot about that, though. I don't know. But I'm just like, what? Anyway, I think that the love interest in this, I don't understand the love for the romance in this. I think that the main character is not extremely capable. I think she's kind of insufferably stupid. I don't understand. Have I convinced you to read this one? So anyway, yeah, I wasn't a fan of this. Even though I really want to emphasize, I do really appreciate the themes. I really do. Okay, let's move on. The last one for today, despite the fact that I just gave a passionate rant about Guns of the Dawn, which isn't even the first time. It's like if it starts to come up, I just start, I can't, I was like, I'll keep it brief, and then I didn't. But anyway, with this last one, it is actually my least favorite thing that I'm going to mention today. It might be my least favorite thing ever that I've picked up. I really didn't care for this, and that would be How to Become the Dark Lord and Die Trying. I was very excited for this one, as I liked the idea of an inversion of a trope that was self-aware and funny. So the idea, as the title implies, is that our main character has decided, you know what, I'm tired of trying to be the hero, I might as well try to be the Dark Lord. And the reason being that something has happened. They don't know how this happened. They have sort of a foggy memory. But something has occurred where it has led them to come back to life over and over and over again. And pretty much their respawn area is always the same spot and the same moment in time. So they have, over years and years and years, tried to become the hero of the tale. And always, repeatedly, over all of these years, they have been defeated by whoever the Dark Lord is. And then they die, usually in really horrific ways, and then they have to come back and start over again. And they're tired of this, so they decide, you know what, if you can't beat them, become them, basically. And I liked the idea of that. However, the book kind of does this similar pattern over and over and over again, which is that our main character, in the pursuit of becoming the Dark Lord, and also just being like totally flippant about everything now because they're like, who even cares? You know what? I'm just gonna have fun this time. They'll approach some new group of people that they're trying to recruit into their army, and they will either think like, I wonder what it'd be like to have sex with them. And because they're fantasy beings, there's also an element of like, so what exactly gets them going? Is it like stroking their horns, or is it like petting their tail? And she pretty much has those kinds of thoughts about any even slightly humanoid shaped creature. And then if the creature is something really darling and cute, she's like, oh my gosh, one thing I didn't think about when I was going to become the Dark Lord is how cute some of these races of things are. And you're just like, okay. And it's that over and over and over again as she's attempting to recruit cute races of things or things that she contemplates how she would have sex with them. Over and over and over again. And there's footnotes throughout the story, and the footnotes are almost always some kind of like snarky thing that I guess is supposed to be funny. To me, it always felt juvenile. And also, the main character, I just feel like it's a little bit of a trope that I can't speak for everyone, but from what I understand, this trope is a little tired for some people, which is the extremely hypersexual, bisexual woman. And I think that is this character to a T. And it's like, it's just basically like, I'm bisexual, and that means I'm a freak. And that's kind of this character in a nutshell. And I don't know, that's not a compelling, interesting character to me. That's a stereotype a little bit that I'm just kind of like, you know. Or we can actually dissect that in a really interesting and engaging way. Or we can just have her be like, oh my gosh, like when he finishes, his tail wags like a dog who just got peanut butter. And you're just like, oh, okay. And it was just that. And are you tired of me saying it was that over and over again? Well, then try reading this book. If you don't like repetition, it's a challenge. I wasn't a fan. That's basically it. I wasn't a fan. I found the character to be one of the most annoying characters I've ever encountered. I thought the humor had the potential to kind of be funny, and instead it was just, I don't even want to, there's a part of me that wants to be like, it's what a middle schooler would think is funny. Like, you know, when you encounter, you're just trying to eat somewhere, and there's a group of young people who are cursing a lot, and you can tell they're doing it because maybe they're not allowed to even say, like, that sucks at home. So they go really far extreme when they're not around their parents or something. Or they just say, like, really very filthy things because, like, for shock value, and it makes them seem edgy. And you're like, you still sleep with a stuffed animal. Nothing wrong with that. But also, like, you're not as edgy as you think, but you're finding yourself and you're trying to figure out, like, what, you know, you're just becoming a person. That's part of becoming a person. However, even though I want to say that this book is basically like a middle schooler trying to sound edgy, I'm like, I used to teach. A lot of middle schoolers are phenomenal and extremely mature, sometimes more mature than a lot of adults. And they're great. They're wonderful human beings, and it feels wrong to call this that. But that concept, that kind of image we have, or like I said, that like encounter maybe some of us have had with that like group of kids basically trying to be cool and trying to like be cool to other kids. That's what this book just felt like. It was trying really hard, and I didn't really think it I didn't think it was very funny. I thought it was too repetitive. So on that note, that's it for some books that didn't work for me. I hope that you disagree and you think they sound great, and if you pick them up, I hope you really like them. But maybe, as I said at the beginning, you can kind of see now why these wouldn't necessarily be the first books I think of when I'm like, oh, what's a great, like, adult fantasy with adult characters? Like, I don't know how to become the Dark Lord and die trying is going to be the first one that pops into my head. But I digress. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later.